I haven't spoken about this work on salmon genomics for quite a while, and so it was really fun to go back to it and see how it's changed in my mind. I also reread the title on the program, and I apologize. That's a bad risk communication. So I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my collaborator, Mike Burgess. We've been working for quite a number of years now on public deliberation as a mechanism to bring a public voice into decision-making processes. So policy, institutional policy, or larger policy frameworks. And the challenges we've been trying to do with these types of trying to overcome with these kind of processes is to have number one, a meaningful inclusion of diversity of perspectives. And meaningful is of course a very loaded term here. I hope to sort of unpack that a little bit as we go along. We also want to have that public voice be considered rather than a top of the head type of response. And the idea here is that if we're dealing with very sensitive issues or really things that matter, we don't want just off the cuff, here's what I think. We want a meaningful, considered input to be useful for policy making processes. We want the input to be reasoned, so it shouldn't be just a position you hold for no reason other than that's the position that you hold. So there should be a transparent trajectory to the position. And we also want that public voice to be dialogical. So rather than be a one-way information flow where we do some interviews or focus groups and that's it, that's the end of it, that gets articulated and put into policy, we want there to be more of a back and forth that allows for transformation of views and integration and synthesis of knowledge before it actually is finalized as input. And all this together, we believe, provides a stronger foundation for consideration of both risks and goals, values into social agendas. So we've done this on a number of different topics. I'm today going to be talking about salmon genomics. And the context here is that we were concerned with the ethical, legal and social issues related to salmon genomics. And there were of course Genome Canada projects that dealt with this. But the event that really crystallized this particular public deliberation event was a proposal to sequence the salmon genome. So salmon itself is a very divisive topic on the West Coast. There are multiple stakeholders with resource conflicts, but also conflicting values on how salmon should be viewed. And so it's into this very polarizing context that then salmon genomics as a science with all sorts of actual and potential application emerges. So the question to us was, this was very early on in our work on public deliberation, and before that we dealt with human tissue biobanks, which is ethically complicated, but not really that divisive. And so to us this was a real test case to see, do these deliberative processes work in these kind of divisive contexts, and how do they look different. So the goals with this project were to investigate the potential impact of salmon genomics on ethical, legal, social issues and what new issues are raised by the science. We wanted to provide a forum where reasoned discussion could take place, and I think sort of vaccine hesitancy is a real sort of counterpoint here, where there's, I think, a real lack of reasoned discussion, a lack of forums where you can have this conversation. We wanted to document public positions on the emergent issues, and then finally we wanted to test our model of public deliberation on this topic. So talking just about the methodology here could take a whole hour, so this is very condensed by necessity, and of course I'm open to questions on detail on any of this. We used a random digit dial for recruitment for demographic stratification relative to the BC census. We oversampled to 32 with the aim of having 25 people complete the full event. And we aimed for diversity rather than strict representation. So the idea was to get, with the constraints of a small sample size, how do you get as much diversity as possible into the room? And we got people together for 4 days, so a weekend, and then separated by a weekend, another weekend, and we had 25. We succeeded in having 26 people attend the initial event and 25 go through the whole process. An important component of the deliberation work is that it should be informed. So a lot of work goes into preparing information materials ahead of time. And the challenge here is, how do you do this in a neutral way? Bias is a word that's come up a lot here today. So we don't try to be neutral or unbiased. Rather, what we try and do is to document different societal positions. So we do very extensive search of media, peer-reviewed literature, and so on. And we don't take a position. We just say, here, these are the positions that are out there. But of course, part of that is the scientific information, and that needs to be condensed and written in a way that is very accessible and usable by people then in the deliberation. For people familiar with the science and technology studies literature and public understanding of science, this work is very much very conscious of public deficits models of public understanding of science. So the idea is not to provide this information to the public so that they can make good decisions or better decisions in the end. Rather, the idea is to provide the information so that it enables good deliberation. And that's something we can discuss in more detail, but I just want to put that out there for now. So we've got the booklet. We also provide additional readings to people if they're interested. We start off the whole event with expert and stakeholder presentations, usually about 5 or so. We have a website dedicated to the event. And we also had I'm not sure if I've got a picture of the model here somewhere, a physical model that kind of took all of these abstract ideas and entities and put them on a table and said, here, this is where DFO sits, this is where the fisheries sit, this is where the salmon farms sit, and so on, and how they relate to each other. Here's a quick overview of the event design. We start off with 25 demographically stratified participants being selected or invited. We pre-circulate information. They come together for the first weekend. We start with information provision, question and answer sessions, and then we start off very gradually to get people used to talking about the issues in a way that we consider deliberative. Usually we start off with a task we call a hopes and concerns task, and the idea here is that people still operate very much from an individual perspective. They talk about, here are my concerns with the technology, my concerns with the science, here are my hopes for what I think this could do for us, and so on. People then go home. We encourage them to talk with family and friends to get even further input into the process. They come back for a second weekend, and here's when we really start the deliberation aspect of this. And we try and move people away from expressing individual personalized views for their hopes and concerns towards collective positions that ideally encompass the diversity of views that are available. So the idea is not so much that we want to change individuals' positions or opinions or minds, but we do ask them to at least be willing to change their positions. And so what we find quite often is actually what you described, Natalie, where people don't really change their minds on something, but they say, I still have the same opinion, however, I now understand the different perspectives on this, so I do understand now that we have to have a broader, more overarching policy that accommodates these differences. And then ideally what we have is that people formulate collective positions or recommendations on a number of salient issues on the topic, which then get documented and reported out. So the deliberation looks as follows. We have people talk in a large group of all 25 people, and also in breakout groups of anywhere between 6 and 10 people. What we want in deliberation is for people to engage in respectful, reasoned dialogue in which they consider scientific evidence, personal values, cultural perspectives, expert positions that have been presented in working towards collective, civic-minded solutions to the problems under consideration. And as I've already said, what we want to see in a successful deliberation is a gradual shift from representing individual disparate opinions to these collective recommendations. Consensus is something that we aim for, but if we don't achieve it, we don't consider that a failure. In fact, consensus can itself be a failure if it's shallow and does not consider the depth of perspective that should be considered, or if it's premature, or if it's forced and captured by a particular vested interest early in the process. And similarly, persistent disagreement at the end can be a failure or a success depending on how it happens. So if we find that we start off with a very polarized group and that polarization stays and unchanged throughout the end, we would probably consider that a failure. On the other hand, if we start off with many disparate views and we end up with a very clearly articulated value disagreement, we would consider that a success because it's definitely a shift forward from the way we started off. How am I doing on time?
Still 10 minutes.
Great. So the results of the deliberation on salmon genomics, we found that overall, remember this crystallized around the sequencing project, and we found that there was a lot of support for that. So in general, people said, yes, this seems to be a good idea. We see no reason at all why this wouldn't be good. In fact, we see a lot of value in doing this. It can enhance our understanding of human impact on salmon and the environment. It can potentially help to slow or reverse that impact, and it can help in assisting sustainable management of salmon. However, there was also this underlying current of, be careful that you don't mess with Mother Nature. So there was this sense of a fuzzy boundary that people didn't want to have transgressed. The discussion in sort of more detail focused on these 5 issues here. There was a feeling that there should be a need for a federal regulatory body. So there was a lot of discussion around the fragmentary nature of policy and regulatory bodies. There was a discussion focused on international treaties. So the idea here that salmon don't recognize boundaries between US and Canada. A focus on public education and engagement. Labeling of salmon, I'll come back to that. And then there were specific concerns that were discussed, such as the sort of the slippery slope, opening Pandora's box concern. Yes, the sequencing of the salmon is fine, but what will it lead to? Concerns around how this knowledge would be used relative to the environment, and then large concerns around transgenic salmon. So in the time that I've got remaining, I want to talk about this transgenic salmon and labeling of salmon issue because I think it illustrates some very important principles that are relevant to the workshop. The scientists that we worked with were extremely concerned that the work they were doing would not be conflated with transgenic work on salmon. Because they said all we do is the genomics, the sequencing and such, we're not doing any genetic engineering. And we found from preliminary work before doing this that it was very difficult, if not impossible, to separate those two things when talking about this in the public mind. And this was actually a real point of contention, thank you, with the scientists, because we said we can't stop people from talking about this. In fact, if we do, it's going to lead to breakdown in trust. And they said, no, we don't want that because our project is not about that. So I'll very briefly tell you here this what happened with GM salmon is there was a strong recommendation for there was recognition that even though sequencing of the salmon genome isn't the same as modifying it, that the one would facilitate the other. And so there was recognition that this is likely to do to more transgenic research, and if we have GM salmon on the marketplace at some stage, which of course FDA has now approved, we want this labeled. That there was strong agreement on this, but the reasoning behind this was quite different from what we find. Oh, I didn't want this. It's quite different from what we see otherwise in the literature. And it had very little to do with the risks. It was mainly symbolic and reflective of other underlying issues. And very briefly, these were, number one, there was the call for labeling was an expression of distrust. So there was a lot of distrust in industry, in government, in the regulatory bodies, and the call for labeling was an expression of that distrust. So when we think about policy for labeling, we have to take that into account. there was also a strong sense of loss of control of food and sustenance, and the idea that people could mess with Mother Nature and not tell us, and we would then be forced to eat this, was very concerning to people. So this was a way of regaining some control. There was also a request for transparency, in the sense of we want labeling. It's not much, but it's the least that we can ask for in terms of having some transparency in this area. And then finally, not everybody was in the group was actually anti-GM salmon or even GM foods in general. So some people saw labeling as a good step forward in promoting acceptance of GM foods. Okay, so let me finish off here. I see this as very illustrative of how public concerns or public perceptions with regards to science and technology can be very different from how experts calculate risks and benefits. And usually we find that public deliberation opens up a much broader conceptualization of risks and concerns, and in many ways is actually, in my opinion, a better expertise than the narrow expertise of individual scientists or scientist groups. Not because the public will ever be as knowledgeable about a particular area, but because different areas of knowledge interact in very complex ways with each other, and we need in which values and different knowledge claims can be traded off against each other and tested against each other and tested for areas of complementarity. So I'll end then by saying that deliberation is not a panacea by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think it has the potential to move us further along on some of these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran.